Let's now turn to a bit about the Book of Discipline. And of course, this is based on the 2016 discipline, and provisions can change, but the essence of what's here in the Book of Discipline carries over from year to year, from quadrennium to quadrennium, and from generation to generation. So this is something of a brief presentation on what we call polity. And polity is the word we use in reference to the governance of the church and our structures. And so we're going to look particularly at the provisions related to deaconesses and home missioners, and then we will look at just a brief review of the overall structures of our United Methodist Church. Now, it's important to recognize that per the discipline, deaconesses and home missioners and the office of deaconess and home missioner falls under the purview of the National United Methodist Women offices. And in the 2016 Book of Discipline, you will find the information about deaconesses and home missioners in paragraphs 1913 through 1918. And so we encourage you to take a look at a Book of Discipline and actually read through those provisions and know what is described and required there. I can only now give you a few important points from that Book of Discipline, but you should look at it on your own. Within paragraph 1913, we find general provisions. We find the forms of service that we've talked about, the alleviating of suffering and the helping to bring out the full human potential and so on. So you will want to review those areas or forms of service. Remember that the deaconesses and home missioners relate to the church as a whole through UMW. Now, that doesn't mean that you relate through your local UMW, but through the National United Methodist Women. As you already know, your home, let's call it that, is within the office of deaconess and home missioner, where you find Megan and you find Scott, and hopefully you already have gotten to know them well. Of course, a deaconess or home missioner is expected to be in full-time service, full-time ministry. That may not always be the case. I'm sure there are a few exceptions, but that is the norm for a deaconess and home missioner. Now, your ministry setting must be approved by the DHM office and then your bishop, who would actually appoint you in that particular setting. But it's very, very important here to note that you must find your own ministry setting and then request that the office of DHM, the Deaconess and Home Missioner office, then send that along to your bishop for appointment. So this needs to be very clear that the office of Deaconess and Home Missioner or the bishop are not responsible for finding an appointment for a deaconess or home missioner. They must do that themselves. And in this paragraph, it will go on to discuss your particular local relationships. Now, these are some important provisions to keep in mind. You must hold church membership in a local church within the conference where you are appointed. So if you are in Fort Worth, Texas. You must have a local church in Fort Worth, Texas. Wherever you are in an appointment and serving in ministry, you must have your membership in one of those local churches under the bishop who also appoints you. You are then a voting member of the charge conference of your local church. In other words, by virtue of your appointment as a deaconess, you then become a voting member of charge conference, whether or not you serve on the administrative council or do any kind of offices within the local church itself. You are part of the charge conference with voice and vote because you are a deaconess or a home missioner. This also means that when it comes time for annual conference, every deaconess and home missioner who is under appointment is a delegate to the annual conference with voice and with vote. This means then you become eligible for election to jurisdictional or general conferences as a lay delegate. But this also means that you should always be prepared to attend the annual conference as a voting lay delegate. And the fourth thing on here is very important to know, and hopefully it's something you're already quite aware of, but that is that if you are a deaconess or a home missioner, the Book of Discipline requires that you participate in a pension plan. The language there is shall, and shall is a you must participate in a pension plan. Whatever your ministry is, however and wherever you serve, you are required to make sure that as you are being paid, you are also participating in a pension plan, either through your place of ministry or through your having set up your own pension fund. But the point here is that the National UMW, the annual conference, they do not provide pension plans or pensions or any kind of retirement money for deaconesses or home missioners. And so again, you must plan and be able to demonstrate how you will be able to support yourself once you retire from full-time ministry. Now, here I want to give you a reminder, and it may make more sense now that you're in the United States, a reminder of the structure of our United Methodist Church. There are three branches, essentially, that work in the overall scheme of how the church is organized and governed. And in fact, the way that the United Methodist Church is structured begins with the Methodist Episcopal Church, the church founded when John Wesley sent Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke to America, and the church was founded in 1784. This was the period just after the Revolutionary War in early America. And the church actually began to establish a form of governance that actually resembles the government of the United States. So the United States is three branches, and the branches of the U.S. are the name is in white lettering. So there is an executive branch, which would be the president and the cabinet of the president and those agencies the president oversees. The legislative, which is the Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. Now, United Methodism is structured much like this. The executive branch is the Council of Bishops. they don't have quite the same power as a president. They don't have veto powers. They don't have any ability to issue executive orders that take the form of legislation. But they are the ones who preside. They are the ones who enact in their annual conference all the provisions of the discipline. And so we think of the executive branch as our council of bishops. Our legislative branch in the United Methodist Church is the General Conference that meets every 4 years with elected lay and clergy delegates from all of the annual conferences around the world. The General Conference is the only body that may revise the Book of Discipline. It is the only body that may introduce new legislation and create new laws and provisions for the United Methodist Church. They are the only ones who could make new laws regarding deaconesses and home missioners. However, that does not mean that the office cannot create programs and requirements because they are then tasked in each quadrennium of carrying out the disciplinary requirements, carrying out the will of the General Conference. That's what the agencies do. That's what your Office of Deaconess and Home Missioner does, is they carry out the will of the General Conference in the 4 years until the next General Conference. Now, the third branch, the judicial branch, is our judicial council. Now, it's important to understand that we did not have a judicial council until 1939. So it is a later addition, but it provides the review of any legislation or any ruling of a bishop within his or her annual conference in a way that judges whether it is constitutional. Our Book of Discipline has a constitution in the beginning, and if you're not familiar with it, it would be worthwhile looking at the Constitution. So every piece of legislation must pass the test of being in accordance with our Constitution. And sometimes you will hear that Judicial Council overturned some legislation coming out of the General Conference, and that's why they have the authority to review and rule on whether or not it meets the standards of the Constitution. Now here, remember, again, this is a difference from the way the U.S. government would work. The members of our Judicial Council are nominated and elected at General Conference. Their length of service varies. That's not important, but understand that the General Conference elects those members of the Judicial Council. Now, of course, in the United States, it is not the General Conference that will elect bishops who will then be part of the Council of Bishops, but rather those are jurisdictional conferences that have the task of electing bishops. And a jurisdictional conference is the equivalent of a central conference. Now, let's take a look at that system just briefly so we're also clear on how that works. Now, this is what we call, of course, our connectional system, or sometimes you will hear the principle of connectionalism. And you see in the outer ring, in that outer circle, is the General Conference. There is one General Conference. Then in the next ring, there are 5 jurisdictional conferences in the United States. You should be aware of which jurisdiction you are a part of. And there are currently seven central conferences outside the bounds of the United States. Now, the next ring are the annual conferences, and each jurisdiction or central conference is made up of 2 or more annual conferences presided over by a bishop. Annual conference, of course, meets annually. Jurisdictional Central General Conferences only meet every 4 years. Now, within the annual conference, there will always be districts, and the number may vary, but the district is another level of conferencing. However, it is not required by the Constitution of the United Methodist Church. So an annual conference, and basically the bishop through the district superintendents can choose not really to have any district conferences, but they are often held to do some of the routine business of the church. And finally, at the center of this is what we call the charge conference, which is the conference that does the business of your local congregation, the local church. A charge conference is only allowed to have the nominated officers of the church voting. If a local congregation should decide that they would like to have all of their members eligible to vote at the charge conference, then it becomes what we call a church conference. It's the same thing. It's the district superintendent coming in to do business, set the budget, take the nominations for the coming year, review the reports, and so on. But a charge conference is only for the elected leadership, whereas a church conference is for all of the membership who would like to attend. But again, as we said before, you have voice and vote. You're part of the charge conference of your local church. You have voice and vote as a delegate at the annual conference, and it is possible that you could be elected as a lay delegate to the jurisdictional or general conference. Okay? And up in the corner, you can see that the United States currently has 56 annual conferences supervised by bishops in 46 Episcopal areas. So, in other words, a bishop might oversee 2 annual conferences. There are 75 annual conferences in Africa, Europe, and the Philippines, supervised by 20 bishops. Okay, so this is your brief and basic overview of connectionalism, or this principle of these different conferences that connect and allow us from the local church to the global church to have ways that we intend to be one body, one denomination.